Hello, I'm Dan Turasini, and welcome to Cybersecurity TV from our studios in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Today we have a special live webcast that you're all attending. We're going to address the CMMC proposed rule that was published on December 26th, 2023, just a few weeks ago, and the rulemaking process that is going forward as we speak. Please remember you have a link on your website that you registered here with to submit questions. Those questions will be aired here live. We only have an hour, so if there are more questions, our guest has agreed to answer those questions at a later date. Our guest really needs no formal introduction. He's been on our program a couple of times. And he's joined us here at the studio for the first time. He's widely known and well regarded for his expertise and insight on the DoD's CMMC program. Robert Metzger chairs the Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice group at Rogers Joseph O'Donnell, and he specializes in government contracts, security, and compliant matters. Bob, thank you for joining us in the studios. Very happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm certainly pleased to be here, and I thank not only you and Cyber TV for hosting me, but those of you who have joined the program.
Well, we have a pretty good crowd out there, I saw, at least 175. Let's get started with your overview, get right to the point. CMMC proposed rule and the rulemaking process.
So I do need to do the inevitable disclaimer.
Sure.
I am not offering any legal advice. And what I say is my personal opinion shouldn't be attributed to, anyone, my family, friends, clients, or otherwise. What's so fascinating is that this rule took about, 2 years to come out from when the final 1.0 rule was produced. That's a long gestation. And yet what's fascinating to me, Dan, is that in a sense, how little has changed. CMMC 2.0 was announced, as I recall, in March of 2021. And it essentially said that there were going to be 3 levels of cyber accomplishment. Level 1 for federal contract information, level 2 for controlled information, controlled unclassified information of, let's say, ordinary impact or significance, and then level 3 for unclassified information of higher importance to DoD. Well, that's still what we have. And as announced in March of 2021, the 2.0 CMMC program was going to require that there be an independent third-party assessment for everyone at the second and third levels, or almost everyone. And that's still what we have. And it also said that companies would be expected, as the baseline for level 2, to satisfy revision 2 to NIST Special Publication 800-171. And that remains the baseline. And further, it made pretty clear back in March of 2021 that if companies wanted to continue to do business with DoD, in due course, they would have to pass an assessment. And that is still the same. In fact, it's, the fundamentals of the rule in many respects remain unchanged other than administration and operation since the date of December 31st, 2017, which was the first time that many, perhaps most DoD contractors were required by a contract clause, the DFARS 252-204-7012 clause, to have adequate security implementing the 110 controls of NIST SP 800-171. Now, I'm going to try not to get lost in acronyms and micronyms if there are such things. But it kind of distills to this. DoD made the decision some years ago that there was insufficient accomplishment by its industrial base in protecting itself against cyber intrusion, and particularly theft, then largely by the Chinese, of valuable information that was not classified. And it sought to reduce that impact by improving the confidentiality of such information in its industrial base so that adversaries would not be able to compromise our capabilities by obtaining information from defense contractors even before some of those capabilities were developed or deployed. Well, there's been a lot of gnashing of teeth, complaining, whining, and worrying in the intervening years, and I've certainly had my moments of frustration and doubt. I admit to them. But the fact remains that the threat picture really, since 2017, has gotten only worse. And that's evident from some specific language in the proposed rule, as well as from comments that are made by a number of senior government officials for our government, as well as that of our Five Eye allies, who said remarkably in October that the threat picture was the worst, to paraphrase, that they had sort of seen in their lifetime. We face not only threats of exfiltration from China, but of course other hostile actors, including nation states and hacktivists, ransomware actors, and the like. And we're in a dangerous geopolitical situation. So when you look at this, bulky rule that came out on December 26th, and you wonder, why is it taking so many pages to kind of get to the same points that we started with a few years ago? I think some of the answer is that this is just what it takes to explain to other agencies and to those who are new to the rule why DoD is taking the exceptional step of protecting its defense assets by enforcing that existing 7012 contract clause. That's what proposed rule is all about. It's an enforcement mechanism. It says we're not going to trust your self-assessment and self-attestation. You're going to be required over the course of the rollout period to either self-assess according to our rules or be subjected to a third-party assessment. And just as we've been told for years, if you don't pass that assessment, then you're not going to be eligible to perform DoD contracts. There are some aspects of this rule that are draconian. There are some aspects that are unfortunate. Those are things that can and must be fixed. But to me, the fundamentals are sound. You can read the rule, and it will tell you specifically in its great length that, well, I'll just read a portion. The DoD supply chain is targeted by adversaries with increasing sophistication and frequency and to devastating effect. Therefore, implementation of cybersecurity standards and enforcement mechanisms are critically important. At root, the CMMC rule is an enforcement mechanism. At root, its purpose is to protect the assets of the defense industrial base, and the companies who are subject to the rule are the assets.
Absolutely. Very well said. I think it's interesting, like you said, it's taken a long time to get where we were or where we should have been a number of years ago. So many of our viewers across the defense industrial base have concerns related, A, to compliance, expectations, and the timing of what things going to happen now. We talked earlier, we're both of the mindset, get over it, get on with the ruling, and let's get on with protecting our data. What do you see right now going forward as far as compliant expectations and timing of this hitting?
So there are 220,000 companies that are subject to this rule. 140,000 of those are at level 1, federal contract information. And if you're a company that has just that kind of information but not CUI, you should pay attention. First, because it's not going to be that simple. It's not just a kind of wave of a hand to satisfy level 1. But more important, those of you who are working with just level 1 may find yourself wanting to do work that involves controlled unclassified information, in which case you're going to become subject to those level 2 requirements. Now, this is a laborious process. I have to admit to being a lawyer. That's why I wore the tie here. And I have to admit to having done a fair amount of work with administrative law and regulation over the course of my lengthy career, longer than I'll admit to here. And so I understand, I think, a bit about how the rulemaking process works. We have a proposed rule that's out now. Comments are presently due on February 26th. It's possible that DoD will extend the comment period, maybe by another 30 days. I expect that DoD will not want to extend it because they are likely to try hard to get this rule out in final sometime before this year's election. and I'll tell you why. There's something called the Congressional Review Act, and what that says is that when an agency puts out a major rule, and this is one, it has to give Congress 60 days to have time to overrule it. Well, that 60-day period starts when the final rule is done. It has to finish within the term of a current Congress. So if DoD were to put out a final rule on November 18th this year after the election, that 60-day period will not conclude until early 2025, in which case it will restart. And for all the effort that's gone in, there will be powerful reasons for DoD to try to compress the usual review cycle of this rule so that it can become final perhaps in October. I know that's ambitious. There were, 750 or 850 comments to the September 2020 proposed in-prim rule, and DoD has answered a fair number of those here. And there's likely to be a lot of comments to this rule. The more comments there are, the more time it's likely to take. Industry can do itself a favor. If your objective is, in fact, to get this rule done on the ground and working and be part of its implementation as opposed to its frustration or delay, then I urge people to exercise some restraint, only some, in trying to make their comments, constructive and helpful. And what that takes is doing more than just criticizing the things that we question and which frustrate us, but coming up with some of the answers. Because there are people on the other side at DoD who are going to have to read these comments, allocate them into categories, and decide how to respond and whether to change the rule. But in any event, there's two parts to CMMC. This is a new part. It's a new part 170 to Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations. This is the first time that we'll have a part of the Code of Federal Regulations that describes the kind of operations, purpose, and policy of the CMMC program. Although it says a lot about what contractors are supposed to do, it's really telling DoD itself what it is supposed to make contractors do when the counterpart contractual implementation provisions are also in place. Those are in a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations. They are in Part 48. It's in Part 48 that we have the Federal Acquisition Regulations. We have the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement. Part 48 is that portion of the regulatory scheme that essentially includes the contract clauses that will implement CMMC. And without getting too elaborate, the Office of Management and Budget has said that it expects to put out in March, just a couple months from now, a new notice of proposed rulemaking on the companion changes to Part 48, Title 48 of CFR. We need to synchronize Title 48 to this new Title 32 in order to have, the whole system that will be necessary to both guide DoD in the CMMC program and obligate contractors to conform.
And just back to the commenting period, does the DoD have the capability of saying that if it's already been asked, we just give you the answer we had before. We're not going to re-understand all these questions, because I think there's going to be a lot of repeat questions. This has already been through a question and answer. And then the other piece is, has they made it clear enough that NIST 171 is not part of the questioning period? That's a different animal. If you want to talk to NIST
Sure.
about that, fine.
So those are great questions. I was surprised at how long this rule took. 81 pages in the Federal Register is a long read. Frankly, to those who've been following the program closely, much of it is unnecessary, surplus, and duplicative. I almost had the sense that some of it was to persuade other agencies who are involved in the review of the rule by operation of this OMB process, that they should understand what DoD is doing. And some of it was to explain to new companies new to it, why they were being asked to do this. The heart of the rule is in the stuff that goes into this Part 170. Well, much of the narrative also was devoted to answering existing questions. I think it likely that DoD will not put itself to a lot of trouble to answer existing questions that have already been answered. I do think that they will try to answer or respond to every question. That doesn't mean that they will respond to things that are outside the scope of the rule. Yes, there may be questions about which version of NIST 171 will apply, but those things are not, in certain respects, those are not DoD's problem. DoD did say in the rule that it recognizes that the threat environment may change. It did say in the rule that it knows that the NIST 171 Rev 2 publication itself may evolve. It said, in effect, that it might issue further regulations to address a revision to the NIST standards, or that there might be new NIST standards that it takes into account in scoring or otherwise. DoD also has some contractual authority as to revisions to the 171 rule, essentially to issue what's called a class deviation so that there's no conflict in the timing of the effectiveness of revision 3 to the 171 requirements on the one hand, and the timing of the final date of effectiveness of the new CMMC rules.
Well, that's very interesting. So let's go to affordability and sustainability. The DIB has to do the security compliance, and they're concerned with, of course, the cost and how they can sustain a business. In many cases, this is going to be dependent on cloud service providers, managed service providers, and external service providers. So tell us a little bit about how you think this is going to flow.
Well, this is a crucial issue. There's a lot of detail in the proposed rule about different types of cost. The discussion focuses not on the underlying compliance costs because DoD assumes, rightly in my view, that most companies subject to this rule have already had contract clauses that require their compliance with the 110 controls in the NIST 171 standard. So their focus is on what are the new costs. Those are the costs of undergoing an assessment, making the report of that assessment, closing any gaps or plans of action and milestone. And yet it is an expensive program viewed overall. I think the estimate was $42 billion over a 20-year period, a long time. But we need to kind of zero in on where the expense will be most difficult and who might be struggling the most. And that's probably on the 55,000 or so small businesses who are part of the 77,000 that DoD expects will be subject to level 2 certification assessment. These are the companies who will be required to meet 171, undergo a third-party assessment, and be required to pass it and get a certification in order to continue to do business with DoD. And there are some serious issues there. Although companies have known what to do for a long time, there are many who have chosen not to do it. There are many who say they can't afford it. There are many who struggle with the financial, technical, or human resource capabilities to meet the rule. DoD has done a fair amount so far to try to help them, but I don't think it has been enough so far. And it's a crucial issue to make sure that this rule not only makes sense, analytically from a nice distance in a TV studio, but is achievable and affordable on the ground. And there are reasons for hesitation there. One problem is let's call it the uniformity of the rule. It tends to assume that, in effect, it homogenizes the defense industrial base into one large base where everybody has the same capabilities and can do more or less the same thing. There's not a lot of provision in this rule for risk-informed adjustment to fit the circumstances of particular companies. And yet those circumstances actually differ for every company. And there's some provision in the 171 standard that allows for risk management, but not really quite enough in the rule itself, in my judgment. But that takes us to the crucial other part of your question, managed services. Well, I've been told by various sources, I read recently something attributed to the White House and talked to colleagues at MITRE, where I've been a consultant about managed services, And I've been told that something upward of 80% of the defense industrial base uses managed services or managed security as a service. Essentially, this is the means by which many small businesses transfer substantial responsibilities to third-party organizations to help them with the basic organization and maintenance of their IT systems and to help them specifically with cybersecurity and compliance. Well, I mean, this is a widely known fact. MSPs are crucial to the security of the DIB and to most companies everywhere. And yet, when you read this 81-page rule, there are exactly 2 mentions of managed service provider. One is in a definition that never appears anywhere else, and the other is in a footnote that has no relevance to what they're supposed to do. And this is one of the oddities. For all the detail that is provided on so many things, there's really very little said about managed service providers, managed service security as a service providers, or external service providers. They are put into a category and a table, you know, where you might interpret it to mean that, well, if they don't hold or host, process, store, or transfer controlled unclassified information, then the CMMC requirements don't apply to them. But that's an oversimplified view of the world. Most managed service providers, most MSPs, they're going to have some interaction with a client, even if it's brief in time, where they do have theoretical access to CUI on the system of their client. We need to do better. We simply can't, you know, have this situation proceed where companies are worried that use of a managed service provider will expose them to unknowns in the assessment process, such that they might spend the money to get the help only to find that an assessor won't approve it. We don't know enough yet about what the assessment needs, and we don't even know whether 171 in its totality is the kind of right answer to this question. There could be variations. These are subjects that I think need to be worked as the highest priority among, you know, the technical specialists, the customers and clients within the DIB, and of course the government.
So in my role in the CMMC ecosystem, as you know, I'm a CCA. I've tried to focus on supporting these small and medium-sized businesses. And these SMBs, as they're called, have unique challenges. And in part, that's due to this, I think you alluded to, one solution fits all kind of mindset. And we make rules, we make suggestions, and it's a lot of people around the Beltway doing all of these, you know, interesting thinking. Meanwhile, you have a lot of built-to-spec small businesses. Maybe they're doing stuff with 3D printers and stuff like that, and they don't have the IT facilities. They might have to go to an MSP. One thing that's important to note is that, for example, in the area of data in transit, there are physical alternatives, right? So you don't have to be, you know, with the big firewall and the big VPN and all of that. If you're just moving data from a secure location in an encrypted format to another location to process that information. So how do you expect the SMBs will be able to focus on this outside of this one-size-fit-all environment?
Well, you know, I think that the outcome is yet to be written. You know, if there are 55,000 or 75% of the companies subject to level 2 assessment who are small businesses, and a high fraction of them genuinely worry that they can summon the technical, financial, or human resources to get this done, well, then the rule is not going to succeed. You know, we don't want anybody to misrepresent their achievement. That's not good security, and it's certainly not good compliance. And we have, you know, I know that the National Security Agency and parts of DoD, including the Office of Small Business Programs and the SBA and Project Spectrum, there are a lot of government resources out there that are trying to help. I give them a lot of credit. But the truth remains that most, perhaps many small businesses would rather find ways to solve these problems with commercial resources rather than rely upon the government to get it done. Now, DoD has said that it's going to run a cloud enclave pilot with a view to offering a sort of enclave approach to small businesses. And there are a number of commercial sources that are offering those. Well, for that to happen, we need to get some guidelines, some rules of the road that are achievable and affordable for those kinds of enclave cloud service offerings to be reachable in a timely fashion by small businesses. This isn't a wish, it's a must. We are heading into an election season, and while there's general unanimity that the threats we face certainly merit stronger defenses against the risk of exfiltration or other cyber breach, there's also merit to questioning a rulemaking enterprise if it sort of postulates a situation that can't be achieved by a large fraction of those who are the intended subject of the rule. And this is a place where I hope good, strong comments can be made, and industry and government can align so that we answer these challenges. So far, there are big questions yet to be resolved. Now, what would I do if I were a small business? I frankly might be asking the question of my primes, can you help me? I might even be asking the questions of my owners and partners, can I afford to stay in the DIB? That's the last thing we want. We don't want to lose small businesses from the DIB. We don't want to keep innovators out of the DIB. That's contrary to other national policy. And, so we've got to solve this. Now, what does it take? I think it takes a more flexible and informed approach to managed services, to cloud service offerings that are hosted by cloud service providers, to manage security as a service. Instead of walling those things off and increasing the burdens and the cost to getting them, we need to make them more available, more accessible. Yes, we want them to be trustworthy, but we don't want to try to force small businesses back into doing it themselves on premises. If that was going to work, they would not already have gone to the use of managed service providers for DoD or other commercial markets.
So we really need a path, and we don't know where that, maybe you have ideas of where that can come from. We really need a path to get these managed service providers. And there are many, everybody knows the big guys, right? But there are many small and medium-sized service providers that support the DIB, as well as customers outside the DIB, some customers that are playing in the DIB and not playing in the DIB. What are your thoughts on the development and where it would come from of this mechanism? And like you said, it might not be all of 171, because the managed service provider may be only doing 30, 60, 90% of what needs to be done to support your assessment. But there's definitely a cost savings, right? So if a managed service provider is certified, let's say 60 out of the 110 practices under CMMC, under a third-party assessment, that dramatically cuts down the cost.
Absolutely.
Of the end user's assessment.
Look, there are some third-party service providers out there now who would say that they can cover 85%. It's never 100%, because the client of any form of managed service provider ultimately is responsible for certain actions that can't be transferred to anyone else. And it's essential that you have a client responsibility matrix or a shared responsibility matrix that describes, who has which responsibility for what events or what actions. But what we have now is a situation that at best is opaque and at worst is impenetrable. There was a recent memo from the Office of the DoD CIO that suggested that a company that is FedRAMP equivalent, as is presently required by the DFAR 7012 clause, is one that must meet 100% of FedRAMP moderates 325 controls derived from the NIST SP 853 catalog. It can have no POAMs, and it must have all of the documentation that you would associate with a FedRAMP authorization and go through much of the process and be assessed by a third-party assessment organization. Well, that's like all of the pain, cost, suffering of time of FedRAMP, but without even an end result of a joint authorization board assessment. It's just unworkable. So I was asked by a major client today kind of what I thought of this. And what I thought of this is, in a sense, the same answer that I'd give to your question, which is at a little different scale. I think DoD is populated by smart people who mean well. I also think that in some areas they're not really well briefed on the granular level issues that arise across the country with at different companies. They need to hear this. And I think that if they are told where the problems are and given constructive suggestions on how to fix them, they can do so. Now let's talk about external service providers. There's the treatment of ESPs that merits a couple of paragraphs, essentially, and a few table references, even though they're so important in this long rule. We got to change that. We got to come up with some guidance that DoD endorses that can be taught by the Cyber AB, that can be applied by the assessors such as you, where when you go into a company and you see that they're using a managed service provider or some other form of external service provider, you're going to know what you are expected to see from the client of that service, from the service provider. And we absolutely must find a way where once a third-party service provider, an ESP, once they are approved in accordance with appropriate standards, that they don't have to go through reapproval for each and every client. We just can't have that. And we can't have a situation where tens of thousands of companies at level 2 really have no way to know how an external service provider can be assessed, who would assess it, under what contractual basis it would be assessed, and whether the result of one assessment for them will be credited for, the next client. There are ways to make sense of this, but, these are matters that now have great urgency. Because if this rule comes out and essentially discourages many in the DIB from using external service providers, the consequences are much more bad than good. Not only will it tend to force companies away from the DIB, but it will also cause many valuable external service providers to, retreat. If the proposition is that external service providers will kind of go the long, expensive road to get FedRAMP moderate equivalency demonstrated, I doubt it. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this. I mean, I have experience with clients today in this area. FedRAMP has its purposes, but these are not the same as what we're trying to achieve in this sense. When we talk about external service providers, Dan, we're talking about services from commercial organizations where the services are of a commercial character being delivered to commercial customers who happen to be government customers. This isn't the same as providing a cloud service to a federal agency or department that's subject to FISMA. It just isn't. The objectives aren't the same. The methods need not be the same. Do we need to have sufficient assurance as to any external service provider? Yeah, we do. Do we have the standards, process, policy, and procedure well articulated now? No, we don't. And we need it. And to me, this is an area where NIST could do us all a lot of favors by kind of getting into the act, and where DoD needs to show now, more flexibility and at the same time, be a little more specific as to, what is required, perhaps taking some time during their rollout period of CMMC to be more accommodating for what the marketplace is today, rather than attempting to insist on outcomes that cannot be achieved.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting, my other role as a provisional instructor, I teach the CCP and the CCA classes. The CCP, which is before the CCA, certified CMMC practitioner, that course has a lot of discussion about external service providers, about managed service providers. And then it goes out there and it kind of says, but you as the customer are responsible for making sure they're FedRAMP or equivalent.
Right.
And when you're talking about the small, medium-sized business environment, we're outsourcing this because we're not IT experts. How are we going to evaluate how good they are?
The proposed rule continues to say that. Some of it traces back to the 2016 version of the 7012 clause, the one that says that if you're using cloud, it has to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and it makes it the responsibility of the cloud client to demonstrate equivalency. Well, a lot has changed in the cloud world in the intervening years, and we have really not just an obsolescing, but an archaic provision in the rule as it stands. This is an area where the Part 48 rule really needs improvement. If the notion of equivalency to FedRAMP moderate is construed to mean identicality, we are making a big mistake that will just not succeed. It will fail. Fail for its intended purpose and fail for the companies it's supposed to benefit, as well as for DoD. You can't ask the impossible or the unaffordable, especially when the impossibility and unaffordability is likely to affect not just the cloud service offering, the provider of that offering, as well as the clients of the offering. This is kind of a null set, if I use the term correctly. Now, another notion that's, it would be amusing if it didn't have such powerful actual consequences. There is still a notion that it is the job of the company being assessed to have the SSP and to be responsible for the equivalency of its cloud service provider. I can tell you to a certainty that the number of cloud service providers, FedRAMP authorized or not, who are willing to share their SSP with any of their clients is vanishingly small, approaching zero. Yep. Now, in the rule, interestingly, the proposed rule, it says you can use other documentation. Well, that's encouraging. It doesn't tell you what that other documentation is, but at least other, has some range of permissible outcomes. But we go back to this January 4 memo that came out from DoD that does tell you what the other documentation is, and it's essentially a replay of the FedRAMP moderate catalog that, in my view, is mistransported to the wrong place. I don't want to sound like this is the only thing, wrong or needs to be improved with the rule, but, the fundamental problem is this. It should be obvious to DoD what is already obvious to industry. And that is that the era of on-premises solutions that are designed, administered, and maintained by on-premises personnel exclusively, it's over for most companies. It's just too hard to do. And there are too many outstanding services of so many types that are available from third parties. Could be, a system incident and event management. It could be endpoint detection or response. It can be firewalls. It can be MSPs, managed security as a service. There's so many companies that specialize in providing very high quality external services, including some who are already adopting or have adopted zero trust principles and employ AI for threat detection. Do we really want to tell the 220,000 companies in the defense industrial base that they have to do this themselves and can't look to those except the very few who are FedRAMP moderate or can, put together this replica package in a timely fashion? I don't think so. And that's why I think this will ultimately get fixed, but the fix is going to require some, carefully crafted input from industry, I think reconsideration from DoD, and I would like to see that NIST gets involved to help.
I agree. And personally, my advice to industry would be get some of your folks through the CCP training, maybe through the CCA training. I know that's contrary to the AB's thinking. We need the CAAs, we need the assessors to be assessing, but you need to know what needs to be in there. It's not just reading 800-171, it's not just reading the assessment guide, it's understanding the mindset of the people that are going to come in there and assess what they're going to be looking for, and that's going to help you understand how to set up your own individual.
That's a great point. I hadn't given enough attention to the CCA role until recently. I was reminded by a client that is a C3PAO that CCPs, a certified cyber provisional, is that the term?
No, certified CMMC professional.
Certified CMMC professional. CCP can work in support of a C3PAO assessment as long as they're supervised by a CCA in the assessment. That's a lot of verbiage. But what it says is that you not only have to have a couple of years of actual experience doing assessments, you can be trained and accredited by the AB and support assessments. Well, you get a lot out of that, I gather. And, you know, the idea that this should only be a resource that is used in third-party assignments, well, I don't think only should be retained, because you've made a key point. For many companies, you know, one choice is to hire advisory firm ABC to do a mock assessment. But once you hire that advisory firm, the conflict of interest rules prevent them from actually doing the assessment when it's required. But another good choice, if you're large enough, is to hire ACCA or to train one internally. And there's nothing that says that you can't. I mean, really, the smart move is not just to ask the third-party advisory company to tell you what's good, bad, or indifferent, but if you can, to have somebody on your staff all the time who is in the midst of the evolving cyber AB process, who works on the cyber assessment plan, the CAP, somebody who is involved in the interface with DCMA's DIBCAC unit as we come to understand how these rules will be applied, because that gives you some, you know, inside but perfectly legitimate knowledge of how these rules actually will be employed. And right now, on some of these key issues, we know, of course, what the broad outlines are. We know what the requirements are, but do many companies really know how they will be applied to them? Not many at all.
Yeah, and I think your point is well taken, especially with the MSPs and the other service providers. We need to stitch something together, right? Because this is going to be, I'm going to get some stuff here, I'm going to get some stuff there, and the end user, the contract holder is not going to be able to do the evaluation. So we're going to have to figure out a way to parse out the assessment guide, if you will, for the particular requirements that each kind of ESP, MSP are going to be attacking.
So, you know, if I go back to first principles, there are some key things that just haven't changed, but their application may have evolved in a misdirection. We're still looking at 110 standards in Rev 2 of 171. Those are still in, what, 14 families? Same families. Each of those standards is presently the subject of a single sentence declaration of what it is. And we're still looking at essentially the same guide for assessment that has assessment objectives and, you know, methods of obtaining evidence. All this stuff is already there. The problem isn't in knowing what to do. It's having confidence that the methods that you've chosen to do it actually will help you pass an assessment. Because now we have a 3-phase rollout. And the first phase is 6 months after this rule is effective. And there's a small number of companies that will see a required assessment then. And DoD has to use its discretion to include a CMMC requirement in the first 6 months. That's not so bad. But in the next year, you know, a year, beginning 6 months after the rule is final, in the next year, the presumption is that the certification requirement and the assessment requirement, whether it be self or third party, the assumption is it's going to be in your contract and solicitation, unless DoD uses its discretion not to include it. But 18 months after the rule is effective, then DoD has said very clearly in the proposed rule, everything is going to be subject to this unless there's some high-level waiver from a requiring activity or program office. So, you know, companies that are listening to this, you should not be thinking that this is still a problem for another day to be worried about later. It's a problem for today. Do I think this rule will get finalized? I do. Do I think it should be finalized? I do. I, you know, buy the threat risk. I am convinced DoD is right that if we don't finalize this, we're going to leave our industrial base vulnerable to plunder and other nefarious activities that have only gotten worse in the last few years. I take this very seriously. But at the same time, I also take seriously these core ideas of affordability, practicability, necessary flexibility, and the essential requirement that we not just offer government help to small businesses, we enable small businesses to get market-driven solutions that they can afford and trust on a commercial basis. That's just crucial, and we're not quite there yet.
Mm-hmm. So we're in this public comment period. What are your recommendations on how our customers here, viewers, should address the comments, how to comment, and what to do to get that word across.
So, there's DoD puts out a publication on the comment process, or if I may have misspoken, it may be GSA, but it's obtainable. It's pretty straightforward. There are instructions in the proposed rule as to how you place a comment. Every comment goes into the public record and is accessible by others. There may soon be comments that you can look at to see what others have said. I think comments here are especially crucial. I urge you not to whine, complain, or express generalized grievances about the rule, because that's probably not helpful. DoD has made its decision. It's going to apply high standards to all businesses in its supply chain. It's going to give a lighter requirement only to some small businesses if they have CUI. It's made a decision that the threat is serious enough that it's got to make this hard. And it's made a decision that it's going to enforce these long-standing contractual cyber requirements by making you meet the 7012 requirements in 171. Asking DoD to rethink the whole architecture, I wouldn't bother. Offering a completely new system and structure to get this done, I wouldn't bother with that either, because those are things that are outside, the frame of what's going to be considered. Yeah. So you want to look at, you want to look not at the dozens of pages of narrative as to what has happened before and who said what to whom. You want to look at the, say, 20, 25 pages in the Part 170 rule as published. And you want to ask yourself, what is this going to do to me? What is it I need to fix? What is it I can't deal with? And if you find there are problems, then you should try to articulate them concisely, not in a caustic fashion, but a constructive one. And most important, find ways to offer a suggestion. Even if you don't offer it in every detail, at least give DoD some ideas, both as to why the problem is serious, how it affects people beyond you, and what DoD can do to fix it. To the extent you can, I think comments are more effective if they are organized by groups who have an affinity, a group of small businesses, a chapter of the NDIA, people contributing their insights to a trade association. In this instant, I think the trade association comments are going to be very important. And I think that the NDIA, although I haven't discussed this with them, they'll be especially important because of their geographic reach and how well, they involve smaller businesses. They're not the only one. So this stuff it really matters. As I said, I think DoD is willing here to make the rule better, but we need to facilitate that by not just giving them a chorus of criticism, but by giving them some key suggestions with recommendations, ideally even language to change to what? Instead of just, we don't like it, do it different.
And changes and making things better come with time, right?
It's a journey. I hate that phrase. I really do. But it is a journey. Look, this is a very unusual, if not an extraordinary measure. We are telling 220,000 companies affecting many hundreds of thousands of employees that they're going to have to do things under an enforcement mechanism that involves required assessments, whether by yourself or third parties, and that they're facing this enforcement sanction of being ineligible for contracts for many of them. This is remarkable. I mean, would DoD really do this if they didn't think the threat demanded it? I don't think they would. Does DoD appreciate that this is going to be hard for many? Are they worried about the effects of on small business? I think that they know this. But I think as a matter of national policy, the decision has been made. We're going to do this. And people have to accept that. So now our job in industry is to make sure that we can get it done affordably and practically. And we need to do a little bit of instructing to DoD, why we think it could be done differently here, better there, or less in the next place.
Yeah. Well, don't forget, submit your questions. We got a couple of questions in, but we're not done yet. So if you send your questions in, they'll either be aired on this live webcast, or we'll talk about getting answers to the questions after the webcast. My first question here, let me read this. Obviously, the final CMMC rule will be significant change to doing business with the Department of Defense. Bob, do you see this as a catalyst for other agencies in the U.S. government to move forward with similar initiatives?
Well, no and maybe. So, I've been active in areas of protecting CUI and its many variations for close to a decade, I guess now. And I've been hearing every 3 or 4 months that there will be a counterpart, FAR rule to CMMC that requires assessments and instructs or requires civilian agency contractors to follow the NIST 171 standard. I've written probably 7, 8 years ago that this should be done. Well, I believe a rule has been drafted, but it has not been published. Is it because the civilian agencies are indifferent to the protection of their information? No, but they are wary of the impact of a regulation that might affect many hundreds of thousands of companies if it's not properly modulated and managed. So, I don't know this to be a fact, but my expectation is that the other agencies and departments and OMB and the Office of the National Cyber Director are going to be watching the CMMC experience very carefully. And if that experience proves to be good, if the rule rolls out, is implemented successfully, and if we acquire some evidence that shows a reduced rate of penetration or compromise of the DIB participants, well, then I think that will be encouraging to other agencies. For now, though, I think the spotlight, the glare of the spotlight is on the DIB. However, remember that people in the DIB don't only sell to the DIB. And many companies who sell to the Department of Defense also sell to civilian agencies. And I think it will become relatively common for many smaller and mid-sized companies to adopt solutions that apply across their enterprise rather than, they could be creating enclaves just for DoD, but I expect many will look for ways in which they can elevate the security of their whole enterprise, satisfy CMMC, and have the advantage for their other federal customers of improved security.
And we've talked in a previous session about how this is going to affect public companies through SEC and also with the insurance. So I ask everybody to take a look at some of our older videos on those subjects. Our next question thanks you for being realistic about this subject, as this has become complicated with rules, documentation, and audits. We are with the federal government, right? We are losing sight of real security. How do we get this back to simple, realistic security and stop the influence of vendors who are pushing complexity to sell their services?
Well, that is an outstanding question. And notwithstanding my long involvement with CMMC and its history as a MITRE consultant that worked on the Deliver Uncompromised report, I think about that frequently. From an analytic perspective, if you have a government objective that's important, sometimes you can divide your choice into what you might call an ex post or an ex ante choice. Ex post means that you have a lot of flexibility in what you ask or expect from the regulated companies, and then you punish those who don't do it right, and the other companies learn from the punishment and act accordingly to behave as the regulations might seek. But what we found here, and the MITRE report was part of the finding, is that the regime of self-attestation, in other words, people taking the 7012 clause, promising that they were meeting the 110 requirements of NIST 171, it just wasn't working. And it's not just that it wasn't working as a compliance matter, it wasn't working as a national security matter. We were getting penetrated repeatedly, horribly, and with devastating impact, as is said in the rule itself, this new rule. So, the ex post approach will give you the requirement, and then we'll enforce it by what we learned that you didn't do well. It just hasn't succeeded. And that's why the rule has taken an ex ante approach, which means, okay, we tried it that way, now we're going to try it the other way. We're going to tell you what you have to do as a condition to doing business with us. It's very ambitious for many reasons, not the least of which is the diversity and evolution of threats and vulnerabilities and the range of consequences of adverse cyber actions. It's a hard area, but you know, the explanation for this isn't that people prefer the complex. It is that we live in a dangerous world where the pace, nature, and success of adverse cyber activities has steadily worsened, and where we see more hostile cyber actors almost every day in a situation where we have national security interests down to the mission level, and certainly involving our critical infrastructure, where we just can't continue business as usual. I would love a simple solution. You know, I've looked at the, what is it, SANS Top 8 and the Australian approach. I've heard said many, many times that if you just have 5, 7, 10, or 12 high-level approaches, if they're done well, we'll do better. And that's probably right, if they're done well. The problem is that if they're not done well, or if their implementation is essentially subject to casual discretion as to what I choose to do and what I don't, well, then you get a very uneven landscape of what has been achieved, and you don't come out with the confidence that, in fact, you have protected the assets who need to be more robust and resilient against cyber attacks. So now, what's the answer to this? I think the answer, again, comes back to facilitating high-quality, expert, highly capable, specialized external service providers, cloud, MSP, MSSPs. These people are in the business, many of them for a broad commercial audience, of having terrific products that are intended to enable commercial organizations of all kinds to protect themselves against the same or similar threats. Well, if we lower the barriers to their helping the thousands of companies in the DIB, we're going to have a more affordable solution that's probably of higher performance than just 171 requires. We'll actually advance security above 171. 171 Rev 2 is a baseline, but it's a baseline that's about, what, 6 years old now? I mean, to be nice, it's kind of long in the tooth, which is why NIST is working on Rev 3. And, you know, it isn't perfect against contemporary threats. This isn't news. It's a baseline that we need to build better security, but we're more likely to get that better security by facilitating access to the external service providers who already are able to offer superior solutions at hopefully an affordable cost and less disruption to individual enterprises.
Related to that, we just got a question in here, Bob. Any thoughts on the hard coding of 171 Revision 2 in the rule when Revision 3 will be coming out probably in second quarter of 24?
Well, I touched on that briefly. DoD knows that Revision 3 is coming. Everybody knows. And DoD knows that there's language in the 7012 clause today that says that you, company, have to comply with the version of 171 that is in effect at the time you take the contract with this clause. So if Revision 3 to 171 shows up on April 1st, final, 2024, technically, companies who get a new solicitation after that or an exercise of an option, they're going to have to comply with 171 R3, but only technically. Because DoD can't accommodate that sort of disruption. We don't know what is in Revision 3. We haven't seen the final version of it or its companion assessment. We have this whole infrastructure that's been built up at the Cyber AB as to assessment guides and scoping guidance and training curricula and testing as to CCAs and CPAs and RPs and RPAs. All that stuff is built around Rev 2. And DoD clearly made a conscious decision that it is setting Rev 2 as the baseline. And there are a couple of references that you can find in the proposed rule that says, not in quite these words, we get it, we know it's coming, we may have to change the reg when it's timely, we may invoke some other things before we invoke other things. But the short version is that the actions you take now ought to be driven by compliance with 171 R2. Does that mean that we ignore Revision 3? No, I pay attention to it. I tell clients who can afford it, who have the resources, that we should be paying attention to its best ideas and already thinking of ways in which we can move in that direction. That's for the interest of the client, not so much for compliance. But it is, to me, impossible that DoD would allow a situation to occur where NIST, an independent agency that has no contractual responsibility for anything, it's wise and it's good, but it doesn't actually implement these things. DoD is not going to let NIST say, oh, I'm going to turn the light on for Revision 3, And now all of you at DIB, however many you are, you're going to have to, tomorrow, start to comply with it. And also, to the extent there are organizationally defined parameters that remained unset, you'll have to figure that out. It's just not going to happen. That level of, that reaches the level of implausibility, veering towards unlikelihood, implausibility, and very low probability of occurrence.
And of course, that was issued prior to even CMMC 1.0. It was issued when everybody was doing self-assessments and didn't have to do anything else.
Yep.
And as you said, the DoD is aware we're baselined on R2 until such time that the DoD says, let's move forward.
DoD is going to manage the transition. FedRAMP is built upon SP 853 Rev 4 for most companies. Rev 5 to 853 came out about roughly 2.5 years ago. Mm-hmm. It took about 2.25 years for the FedRAMP Program Management Office to issue the transition guide to go to Rev 5. It takes time. I mean, there's all this accompaniment for Rev 2 that's going to have to be revised before people know what to do with Rev 3, what it means, how it's applied, which parameters are set, by whom. That stuff has to be done, or you've imposed a burden upon companies that they really shouldn't be asked to attempt.
And as you said, let's get the basics done now.
That's proving hard enough.
Yeah. So this looks like a question from a C3PAO. Bob, do you think that the DoD has plans to include regency requirements for evidence collected during an assessment? For instance, if something is less than 90 days old, it can be considered sufficient, but older documents, don't give me the old stuff. There's no real guidance yet.
So you're asking about recency. So there are various situations where a C3PAO is expected to look at a body of evidence and eventually is supposed to hash or put into a cryptological form that body of evidence and send it over to DoD's EMAS system. I don't believe there are any specific rules at present anywhere on what is recent. I did take a look at an ISO requirement, and it made the kind of obvious point that more recent evidence is more trustworthy than older evidence. So I think it's going to be up to the individual discretion of the assessor. If it is a point that's important to the assessment outcome and the evidence is dated a year or two old, that will create more skepticism and doubt than having evidence that exists or was created within 6 months. If I were advising companies and I saw evidence that was more than 6 months old, I would urge them to update it. If I saw it was 2 years old, I would urge more strongly that they update it. Are there controls that say specifically a 2-year-old piece of evidence isn't good enough? No, I'm not aware of any. I may be wrong, but I'm not aware of any. But if I were a company and thinking of that an assessment is coming, I would not want to have important pieces of evidence that are a couple of years old. Right. They're just not as reliable as more current evidence.
The only thing that I know, if you read through the assessment guide and the training, if you're going to provide something that is a policy or procedure or something like that, it has to be reviewed periodically. Periodically meaning not longer than each year. So you should have documentation that is no longer than a year old with signature and dated as such.
Well, that is very helpful. That's a distinction I'm glad you made, because policies and procedures figure importantly into the assessment outcome. But an assessment is not just that you have them, it's also that you follow them. I still think it's better to have a refreshed policy or procedure, but I allow that, of course, there could be some where once set don't need to be changed. But if you have evidence of adherence to a policy or procedure, and that's a year or two old, well, better evidence would be that you adhered to it 6 months ago or 3 months ago.
Thank you. Okay, we got another question here. Can you discuss the phrase contractor risk managed assets that are defined in the rule as assets that can, but are not intended to, process, store, or transmit CUI? For the majority of the contractors who support multiple clients besides DoD, it is very challenging and expensive to duplicate their infrastructure and their cybersecurity controls for two entirely separate domains that can't communicate with each other, one for CUI and one for non-CUI.
Well, this is another example, Dan, of where we have so many words about things that aren't so important, and here we have an issue which is quite important that gets relatively few words. There's now Table 1 to Section 170.19C1, which is one of the few pages I actually copied because I figured this question might show up. And what it says is, contractor risk managed assets are assets that are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI because of security policy, procedures, and practices in place. And it says they have to be documented in the asset inventory, the SSP, and in the network design, and they have to be prepared to be assessed. Well, there's an awful lot of uncertainty as to what almost every one of those bullets means. I mean, not intended to, is this kind of in the eye of one person? Is it in the architecture? Or whose intent is it that counts? But then it goes on to say that the assessor is to review the SSP to determine whether it is sufficiently documented. What's that? I mean, it could mean that you as an assessor say, well, I see you have this contractor risk managed asset, and you tell me you don't use it to deal with CUI, even though you could, and I'm going to decide you have enough discussion of it, in your SSP that I don't have to review it further. But, there are a lot of different branches of this tree depending on what an assessor says or what the contractor risk or thinks or what the contractor risk management asset is. Now here, this is an area where I don't think that we need the regulation to solve it. Let's recall, I hadn't really mentioned this and I should have, that there's a Part B of the new, Subpart B of the new Part 170 that tells, this is the CMMC program. Subpart B says what the Program Management Office does, but Subpart C talks about what the accreditation body does. And that's remarkable, the degree of deference that is given to the accreditation body, which now is the AB, presumably will stay that. DoD made a decision that it's going to move a very large amount of responsibility as to training accreditation and to the decisions of assessors and appeals to those assessors to the AB and the accredited assessors and C3PAOs. DoD said specifically, we don't have the assets to do it at the scale that's required. We are going to build up this independent third-party organization, and it will then train assessors and their supporting cast. They're going to make those decisions. This is fairly remarkable. Not unique, because there are many other federal agencies that do things that are kind of similar, but it's pretty remarkable. But this is an area that is, okay, what the hell does contractor risk managed assets mean, and what are assessors to do with it? What the heck, excuse me. This is an area where I think the AB, working with C3PAOs, working with the CCAs and CCPs, getting stakeholder input, can provide additional detailing as to how this asset category is going to be dealt with. And the same would be true, I suggest, for some of these other categories like security protection assets or specialized assets. Every one of these asset categories, I know from actual on-the-ground experience with real clients, every one of these things, there's something where a lawyer like me can argue about them. I'm not. I don't have to, I do have to. They have to, you don't. And so we're going to need some better guidance, and I think it should come from the AB with DoD's approval. But I don't think we need to have DoD put that into the regulations, because I don't want, Part 170 to require, a supplement and, a wheelbarrow to carry it.
And I will add to that there is discussion and training available in the CCP and the CCA curriculum that addresses these specific questions. I encourage you to either find a CCP or CCA or get someone on your staff trained in that process, because the CCP and the CCA training really do focus on what the assessor needs to look for, specifically in these different asset categories, and then you will be aware of what they're looking for, and by knowing what they're looking for, you can address that within your environment. And it's not a wholesale replicate everything. I can tell you that.
So, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to make this point. In any rule-based regime like this, there's an easy tendency to resolve all questions into doing the most and documenting the longest and demanding the highest. That's not really necessary. That's not the way 171 Rev 2 was written. It's not expecting that any and all possible things that could be associated with each of the 110 requirements are in fact done, demonstrated, and the subject of evidence. That's not how the DIBCAC DoD assessment methodology operates today. They approach it with sufficiency, I believe, and we need not to lose sight of that. This exercise is going to be a lot more successful if assessors understand, and DoD needs to help here, that it is about sufficiency, and sufficiency implies a risk management considerations. It does matter who you're doing it for, what you're doing it about, the nature of the information you've got, the expectations of your customer, the nature of your organizations, its means and resources. We simply cannot kind of resolve all doubts in favor of the 95th percentile, of rigor, because that's going to make this, once again, unaffordable, unobtainable, and unsuccessful. It's not necessary. For some, it's going to be necessary, and if for some, level 2 won't be enough, and DoD will tell you got to do better. But we need never to lose sight of that, concept of sufficiency at, for the individual organization being assessed, at the time, understanding its limitations, capabilities, and the nature of risks it faces.
Absolutely. One last question, because we are running out of time, which is related, and I'd like your thoughts on this. So the question is there an indication that a risk assessment component may be included in the final rule? So if you read the rule the way it's constructed and you look at the assessment guide and everything, you either pass or you don't pass. You're either met or you didn't meet. There's no way to do part of what you wanted, part of what is being asked of you, and then compensating with other alternative methods, and then accepting some risk. Of course, it's not your risk to accept, right? It's the DoD's risk. And I don't know that the DoD would be able to adjudicate.
Well, you're right, and I would argue slightly not right.
Okay.
Because risk assessment is a crucial function in how the federal government applies security policies to itself, and it does not always do as well as they seem to expect of the DIB. The whole RMF architecture on federal IT systems is built around risk assessment. NIST 853 is built around risk assessment and management. FedRAMP, properly applied, is built around risk assessment and management. Well, it's really absent from the proposed rule as such. It really is. And it should not be. However, when you go to SP 800-171, it's not absent, because there's a control family in SP 800-171 of risk assessment that has 3 elements: risk assessment, vulnerability scan, and vulnerability remediation. It's also present in the assessment guide for CMMC Level 2 and in the assessment guide for 171. These are about the same thing, 171A. So, the answer I would give to a company today that needs to do a risk assessment before it decides on the course of action to satisfy controls is to rely upon the language that's in 171 and 171A and the CMMC Level 2 assessment guide. And you would also find there language about compensating controls, which is very, very important. I run into a number of instances where highly capable organizations simply cannot meet the totality of an individual's standards. You acquire a company that had a different non-conforming approach. It may take you 2 years to replace it, or 3. You have certain you have certain assets where, say, manufacturing assets that have an IT interface but are otherwise OT. Well, some of those assets, are excused now from the rule, but some of those, the IT component for manufacturing, they are not. And so compensating controls have a crucial function. It needs to be explicit that companies who experience difficulties satisfying a particular control can apply a risk management approach, come up with a rationale for an enduring exception, and develop and monitor and sustain and improve upon compensating controls. This is how you get real-world success, and you're not trapped into the expectations of identity that otherwise could prove a peril from this rule.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
As I said in our last discussion, I could sit here for another couple of hours, but we're out of time. I want to tell you how much I appreciate all of you coming and listening in on this session. Keep the questions coming if you have them. This will be posted, and the recording of this will be posted on Cybersecurity TV probably within a week, so you can revisit that. Look at there's a lot of information here. So if you come up with questions, please send them in. I will get them to Bob. Bob and I will discuss them, and we'll get you answers as soon as possible. Cybersecurity TV, live webinar. If you like this, if you want us to do more of these, let us know. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate Bob's time and coming to our domain here. It's very happy to have you here. Again, Cybersecurity TV, thank you and have a great day.